Namaskar. Welcome to Prakash on Basics. I'm Prakash Zog. As I mentioned last time, to live we need energy, and that we get through our food, through oxygen, and through water. The last two are the help to release the energy from food. Food, of course, we get from plants as well as animals. Free oxygen and water were not around during the formation of Earth. Neither was the human being, not you, not me, not any of the living cells. We get energy from food is too short a statement. That's not an answer for those who have additional questions like how, why, what, when, etc. So let us try and understand how food is produced and how it gets utilized. There are some scientific concepts that we must first understand to realize how energy gets into food in the first place. There would be some pockets of information that we need to correlate and finally come to food. First, we must realize that nature is extremely efficient. It uses whatever is available to the maximum. The elements most abundant in the earth crust are oxygen, the most, then silicon, aluminium, iron, sodium, potassium, magnesium, sulfur, phosphorus, and of course water, which is a hydrogen and oxygen combined together. Except aluminium, all others of the elements that I mentioned are useful in life and are used by nature in order to develop all the life that is around us. Please realize that all life that we know of is restricted to a few kilometers above and below the horizontal or the ground level that we mostly talk of. Plus or minus 10 kilometers is the upper and the lower limit of all this. And then what about the energy? Solar light energy, also heat energy from sun, and the geothermal energy within the earth has been available to us or to earth all along, right from its formation. So using these two, life has evolved on earth. To combine free atoms and molecules, energy is needed. This energy gets stored as chemical energy. The process of putting molecules together is typically referred to as synthesis. Life on Earth is based on one of the major elements that is around us, and that is carbon. That's because carbon has some special properties. It is said to have four bonds. Let's make it simple. It's like saying that it has four hands using which it can hold on to anything or any other element. There is another very special property that carbon has, which is not there in other elements, except a very few of them, and that is known as catenation, the ability to link itself with other carbon atoms, not just one, but a multiple of them, to form long chains or maybe closed chains of some sort. This catenation then means that out of the four hands that are available, usually two of them are used to couple to two other carbon atoms. The two other remaining ones are connected to the abundant elements that are around us, available in the form of either free atoms or molecules, or in terms of groups of atoms, typically referred to sometimes as radicals or many times just as um, groups themselves. The elements obviously are going to be oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, magnesium, iron, sodium, potassium, and a few more, chlorine, etc. Um, these groups of atoms, which are sometimes, as I said, referred to as radicals, um, have their own typical names. They are known as amines or esters or alcohols or carbohydrates, acids, nucleic acids, phosphates, uh, hydrides, which means that you couple it to carbon and get carbohydrates. Each of them has their own characteristics. These could be groups of atoms. For example, you could have just O and H, or C, O and O, which means carbon, oxygen, and oxygen, or chlorine, or phosphate, which is P coupled to four atoms with a free hand left over, or nitrates, or amines, or just nitrogen, or NH3, or CN, or S, and so forth. Let's not try and remember all these. Let's only remember that there are groups that can be attached to long chains of hydrogen, I'm sorry, to carbon, and these would form a group of compounds which form all the body parts of every living tissue that is around us. And all such compounds are typically referred to as organic compounds. That's what we all of us are made up of. All life on earth is therefore based on carbon. To combine molecules or atoms, as I said, we need energy. This gets stored in the combined form as chemical energy. Synthesis is what happens. And it goes from simple combinations to more and more complex combinations, getting more and more energy stored per gram of that particular material. Let's look into one more major aspect in this process. Earth lifespan, it was formed around, it is believed around 4.5 billion years ago. The first cells were formed around 3.8 billion years ago. Uh, for their formation and beginnings, the energy source obviously was the geothermal heat underwater and the sunlight that is above water. There were a group of bacteria. They are typically known as cyanobacteria. They were formed around the same time of the beginning of life, which is 3.8 billion years ago. These are the ones that came to the surface first. These are typically what are known as the blue green algae, one of the earliest plant-like life, and that existed on Earth. These are all autotrophs. That means they make their own food, and for that they used sunlight as their main source. They used light energy, and whatever elements or objects were around available were utilized. Photos is light. Synthesis is to put together. So what they started off with was photosynthesis. And for that, they used a particular molecule, which was chlorophyll, a pretty complicated molecule. Just to give you an idea, it has 55 carbon atoms, 72 hydrogen atoms, 5 oxygen atoms, 4 nitrogen atoms, and an atom of Mg, that is magnesium. It's very similar to the hemoglobin. I'll come to that later. So that's a pretty complex molecule. And what does it do? It uses sunlight as the energy source. Then it uses carbon dioxide that is there in the atmosphere. And it uses what water is available and combines all this to form the simplest of molecules necessary for building up energy, storing up of energy. The process of recombination uses carbon dioxide, hydrogen, and this results into glucose, the basic storage material. This photosynthesis, by the way, takes place maximum in the red region of the visible spectrum of light that we have. There's one more thing that we must realize. Around this time span when the cyanobacteria came to the surface of Earth, uh, the atmosphere was only methane, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen. There was no free oxygen around. But in the process of this recombination, the carbon dioxide carbon is being used up, and so the oxygen is set free. And this released oxygen first dissolved into the waters that were around, sea, and that developed better evolved marine life in the beginning. This oxygen then combined with the soil and produced certain compounds because oxygen is a highly reactive material. And when all that combination was over, between 2.2 billion years ago to 1.9 billion years ago, this oxygen started being released as free gas molecules, of course, because no single atom can exist. They are always in a couple. Um, and this started accumulating as free gas in air. Gradually, the percentage of oxygen in air started increasing, and it raised to about 10% of the total atmosphere uh, up to around 850 million years ago. And then it continued rising. For this, of course, the gradually evolving plants around also helped. This great event that triggered something more important is known as the Great Oxidation Event in the life of Earth. Without that, we would never have existed. There would be no human beings. There would be no mammals and other animals that we know of. To join molecules, you need energy, and the energy gets stored. We can't produce our own food, so we are dependent on plants to produce the food for us. And these plants not only produce food but store it also. As I said, in the process, they tend to release oxygen. And this oxygen is a highly reactive material. And whenever it combines with the other elements, it tends to store more amount of energy. And when it breaks free, it tends to release more energy. So using oxygen became a better way of evolving the variety of species around. And that's how evolution took its major step. Animals and plants and other combinations, which we will talk of much later, are the ones that started storing and using energy more efficiently. And its final culmination, of course, was what we know of as the humans. So these two are the major factors, these two or three are the major factors that contributed towards the utilization process of a variety of combinations of elements that were available in abundance and oxygen. Water, of course, was available too. And so, this process of developing methods of storing light energy in the form of photosynthesis in plants resulted into combination of carbon and water. But it's not just one carbon that combined. And the process in the first basic molecules, which I told you was glucose, is talking of six carbon atoms and six water molecules. But water, as many of us know, is H2O, that means two hydrogen and one oxygen. So that makes glucose as six carbon, six water molecules, that means 12 hydrogen and six oxygen. So C6, H12, O6. became the basic structural pattern, which we call as glucose, as the storage pattern for energy from the sun, which is our primary source of energy, into plants. It has the basic structural pattern, and so it was also known as monosaccharide. These are some of the terms that we read so often on food and other packages. Um, this arrangement of how this hydrogen and oxygen and carbon atoms are put together can be modified or changed to a small extent. And in fruits, it got rearranged in a slightly different manner. The number, of course, remained the same. So naturally, this was a slightly different form, and it was known as fructose, the second basic unit. And there was one more possible arrangement that took place in case of milk, and that was known as galactose. So you had the glucose, the fructose, and the galactose as the three basic monosaccharides. But it wasn't enough just to have these independent blocks. Because as I told you, synthesis means building up and putting them together more and more and making a more and more complex molecule out of it. So when two of them were put together, it resulted into what is known as disaccharides. Di means two. So these were disaccharides. And there were three options available. So if you put glucose and fructose together, what you get is sucrose. And sucrose is nothing but the sugar that we talk of. The sugar that we eat coming out of cane sugar or beet sugar in foreign countries is the one that is glucose and fructose. And if you combine glucose and galactose, we get lactose, that is talked of as all the milk sugar that is available for us. And if you put fructose and galactose together, you get maltose, the third combination of a disaccharides. Why stop at two? So you could have 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7. And multiple is always referred to as poly. So what you get is polysaccharides. And these are all long chains, carbon, carbon, carbon plus water, water, water. Not exactly as water, but hydrogen, oxygen in that same proportion. And that is a polysaccharide. And what happens within our body? You have such multiple long chains of polysaccharides. And they are like, those knitted circular patterns that are made out of threads, crochet, and others, big meshes of circular net like structures. And that is the way in which we store our excess amount of available food in our body, which is known as glycogen. A nice word. But when I say body fat, that's the time you start realizing that that may not always be very good. So, glycogen is the way in which we store all this extra amount of material that is available within our body. But then what happens in plants? In plants, it forms longer and longer chains and it results into a very important compound that all of us know of, which is starch. So all food grains, etc., have starch in them. And that starch is nothing but all these carbon chains with water attached groups at different places, forming long chains. Only difference is sugars, etc., are soluble in water, whereas starch is not soluble in water as it is because it's a bit too complex. It has to be broken down. There's another possibility in plants which we all also know, which is cellulose. But I'll come to cellulose sometime later. Uh, this process of putting things together has resulted into storage of more and more energy. So most of the plants begin by storing energy in the form of glucose first, utilize it. Excess is stored as starch. That's not enough. So what they do is start making longer and longer chain units, And if it is a acidic type of a molecule, what is known of as is a fatty acid. But when we use it, we don't use it as a fatty acid, but we use it in the form of what is known as an ester. It's another combination of those elements that I talked of. That again is not enough because there are so many more things available. And I did mention some time back that the cyanobacteria combine oxygen, not only oxygen but nitrogen also, and fix it up in ground. That sometime in school you must have heard of as nitrogen fixation. And this nitrogen being available in nature to such a large extent, the evolution process obviously had to use nitrogen also. And so in this long chain of carbon atoms, if you start fixing up nitrogen also, you get an important structural pattern which is pretty strong and is utilized to make our body parts. And we call this as proteins. So we have carbon and water combinations, which are commonly known as carbohydrates. And then we have fats, as I mentioned. And now I'm talking of proteins as the third, which is the building block of everything, not only in um, human body, but also in plants, because that's where we get it to a large extent. And there's one more aspect, and that is that this nitrogen combination results into chains of certain acids of a number of types, and these are known as amino acids. These amino acids are in fact the building blocks which are used to make the different type of proteins that we know of. So see what is happening. Free atoms are being combined more and more, being made into more and more complex things. And more amount of the original solar energy is being stored in all this. These oils that I talked of are stored in the seeds and some other aspects of plants themselves. And they might contain from 2 to around 28 carbon atom chains with other groups attached, as I said, forming what are typically referred to as fatty acids. They're then converted into esters, as I did mention. And some of these names are typically known as triglycerides and lipids and omega 3 and omega 6 and omega 7 and omega 9. And when you go for diabetes blood test, it is these that are tested as to how many or what is the percentage of all these lipids and others and triglycerides, etc., within your bloodstream from the food that you have been eating. So you would find that these are the major constituents which tend to store a lot of energy. So this is how plants produce food and store it with them. But nature is pretty shrewd. So when animals developed, what they did was to eat and consume the plants because then the food was already ready. They didn't have to go into photosynthesis. So neither you, neither me, neither any of the animals go into photosynthesis. We don't produce our own glucose. We are shrewd. We utilize the glucose and starch and other materials and fatty acids that have already been processed and produced by plants. So plants are the primary producers. And then herbivores, the ones who eat plants, are primary consumers. They get their proteins and fats and carbohydrates from plants. And the process and the chain doesn't stop here because then there are carnivores who eat the herbivores. And there are some carnivores who also eat plants. And so they get pre processed food ready with stored energy, which they can build into stronger and stronger storage materials. And that's what happens, and that's what we see around us. So the plants are relatively fairly soft tissued, while the herbivores, which store more amount of energy, start building up, store it in the form of fats, and it is the carnivores that develop and utilize them in terms of and store their bodies in terms of very strong muscles and proteins and so forth. this then is how energy gets stored for us humans. The chain that I have been talking of is the one that is typically the food chain that we be always aware of. To build up simple molecules into more complex ones and keep on storing energy. It's not enough just to store energy. We need to break it down. We need to split it up and we need to get this energy released back again. And that then is the second step in the process. That we will come to next time. If you have liked whatever I have told you, please pass it on to your friends. Let them know of how our energy sources work. Let them know of the basic principles. Let them have some idea as to where our food and where our energy comes from. Please like and subscribe to this channel. We'll talk of how this energy is put to use and how we utilize all these proteins and carbohydrates and minerals and salts and so forth and get our energy to operate and function throughout our day, throughout our life, not only now, but from our parents to our next generations. Till we discuss that, Namaskar.